In the autumn of 1903, a federal survey team stood at the mouth of a small opening in the Black Hills of South Dakota, an opening barely large enough for a man to crawl through. They had come to map what lay beneath it. What they found was something almost no one expected. Miles of limestone passages, chambers lined with a rare mineral formation found in only a handful of places on the entire planet, and air that moved. Not a draft, not a breeze passing through a crack. Air that seemed to breathe, pulled inward 1 hour, pushed outward the next, as though the hillside itself had lungs. The lead surveyor that season was a young engineer named Elmer MacDonald, working under the newly formed administration of what had just become Wind Cave National Park, one of the first cave systems in the United States to receive federal protection. His notes, later folded into the park's earliest official records, describe measuring air pressure at the cave's entrance and comparing it against a barometer left outside. The numbers matched almost perfectly, in reverse. When pressure outside dropped, air rushed out of the cave. When pressure outside rose, the cave seemed to inhale. It was, MacDonald wrote, as though he had found the one place in the region where the ground itself responded to the sky. But that was only the beginning of what troubled him. Because long before MacDonald ever lowered a rope into that opening, the Lakota people who had lived across these hills for generations already had a name for it: Washun Niya, the breathing hole of the earth, and they did not describe it as a curious rock formation. They described it as the place where life began. What was a federal engineer supposed to do with that? Was it possible that a geological quirk of limestone and air pressure had somehow been mistaken, generations earlier, for something sacred? Or was it possible that the opposite was true, that something genuinely extraordinary had been observed here long before any survey team arrived, and that the strange behavior of the cave was never a coincidence at all? And if the Lakota had been describing this place as an origin point for longer than anyone could document, what else had they noticed about it that the survey never thought to ask? To understand why Wind Cave became such an unusual case, it helps to understand what the surveyors of 1903 expected to find, and what they actually found instead. At the turn of the century, most cave surveys in the American West were treated as straightforward engineering problems: measure the passages, note the mineral deposits, assess whether the site had commercial value, usually for tourism or mining. Tom Bingham, a settler credited with the cave's initial discovery back in 1881, had reportedly first noticed the opening because of a strange whistling sound coming from the hillside, a sound loud enough, according to early park accounts, to knock the hat from his head. That detail alone should have been a clue that this cave did not behave like an ordinary hole in the ground. By the time the 1899 Federal Survey requests were approved and the park was formally established in January of 1903, expectations had shifted only slightly. The government wanted documentation, measurements, and a sense of the cave's scale. What they got was something stranger. Wind Cave's boxwork formations, thin blades of calcite forming honeycomb-like patterns across the ceilings and walls, were unlike almost anything documented elsewhere on Earth. Even today, more than 1 century later, geologists still debate exactly how boxwork of this density and complexity forms. It requires an extremely specific combination of fracturing limestone, mineral-rich water, and time, an enormous amount of time. The surveyors were not geologists by training. Most were engineers and local men hired for the season, tasked with producing maps that the federal government could use to justify continued protection of the site. Yet even without formal training in mineralogy, several of them wrote home describing the boxwork chambers in language usually reserved for architecture rather than geology. One entry, preserved in the park's early administrative correspondence, compared a particular chamber to the inside of a honeycomb built by something far larger than any bee. That comparison, offered by a man with no reason to exaggerate for an audience, says something about how disorienting the formation actually was to encounter in person, lit only by lantern light, far beneath a hillside that most people in the region had walked across without ever suspecting what lay beneath their boots. And then there was the breathing. Every cave with a single entrance responds to some degree to changes in outside air pressure. That much is not disputed. What made Wind Cave remarkable was the scale of the effect and the fact that its true volume, the total space of unexplored passage lying beneath the Black Hills was, and still is, unknown. Some researchers in the decades that followed argued that the strength of the airflow suggested passages far larger than anything mapped by 1903, possibly extending for dozens of miles beyond what any survey team had reached. If that estimate was even close to correct, the cave breathing at the surface was only a small fraction of something vastly larger, hidden entirely from view. That single realization changed how the survey team approached the site. This was not a shallow cavity to be measured in an afternoon. It was the visible edge of something whose true size no one could confirm. Later surveys, conducted across the following decades using increasingly precise instruments, would only deepen the puzzle rather than resolve it. Estimates of the cave's total volume were revised upward again and again, and by the time cavers in the latter half of the 20th century had mapped a far greater portion of the system, Wind Cave had become recognized as one of the longest and most complex cave systems ever documented anywhere in the world, with the overwhelming majority of its passages still believed to remain unmapped beneath the surrounding hills. None of that later confirmation was available to MacDonald and his team in 1903. They were working entirely from instinct, from a barometer, and from a growing sense that they had stumbled onto something whose scale exceeded anything their maps could yet capture. As MacDonald's team pushed deeper into the passages through the winter and spring following the park's founding, the survey notes describe an escalating sense that they were documenting something with a far longer history than they had originally assumed. Charred material was found in several chambers, evidence that people had entered the cave with fire long before any federal expedition arrived. Worn passages suggested repeated foot traffic over an extended period, not a single curious visit but a pattern of return, generation after generation. Local ranchers and homesteaders in the surrounding hills had long known that the Lakota considered this specific opening significant, though few outsiders in the 1880s and 90s had pressed for details. It was only as the federal survey progressed, and as ethnographers working in the region during roughly the same period began collecting oral accounts more systematically, that a fuller picture started to take shape, one that the geological survey alone could never have produced. That changes how we think about the 1903 survey entirely. It was never simply a team of engineers mapping an empty cavity. Whether they fully understood it at the time or not, they were documenting a site that an entire nation of people had already been visiting, marking and passing down knowledge about for far longer than the federal government itself had existed. The instruments were new, the place was not. According to Lakota tradition, recorded by ethnographers working among Lakota communities in the decades surrounding the park's founding, Washun Niya was the site where the first buffalo and the first people emerged from beneath the earth into the world above. In some versions of the account, the people were led out by a trickster figure whose guidance was not entirely trustworthy, and the emergence itself was neither simple nor without consequence. What remained consistent across the versions collected was the basic structure of the story. Life did not begin somewhere else and travel to this place. Life began here, at this specific opening in the hills, and the cave itself was the threshold between one world and the next. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Because independent of any oral tradition, the cave does something that looks, to any observer standing at its entrance, remarkably like breathing. Independent of any survey, Lakota communities had already identified this precise location out of an entire mountain range as the place associated with the emergence of life itself. Two completely different ways of encountering the same physical location, a barometric survey conducted with modern instruments and an oral tradition passed down without instruments of any kind, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions. This place was different. This place mattered. Oral traditions are not written contracts fixed in place the moment they are spoken. They shift slightly across tellers, across decades, sometimes across the specific ceremonial context in which a story is shared. Historians who work with indigenous oral accounts are careful about this, comparing versions collected by different ethnographers at different times, rather than treating any single telling as the definitive account. What makes the Wind Cave emergence tradition notable is how consistent the core structure remains across the versions that were recorded. The location, the emergence of the buffalo alongside the people, the presence of a trickster figure whose guidance could not entirely be trusted. These elements recur across multiple independent recordings made by different ethnographers working with different Lakota communities decades apart from one another. That kind of consistency does not prove that the events described are literal history. It does suggest that whatever this story preserves it carefully and has done so for a very long time. Layered within the broader emergence tradition is a more specific, less examined detail, one that surveyors and early park administrators apparently never investigated directly, but that persisted among those most familiar with the cave and its surroundings. According to accounts collected from residents and knowledge keepers in the region, a bald eagle was said to return to the cave's entrance on the night of every full moon, arriving after dusk and remaining at the opening until sunrise. No explanation for this pattern was ever documented by the early park administration, and no wildlife survey from the period makes any mention of it. What makes the detail more unusual is what was said to happen during solar and lunar eclipses. On these occasions, according to the same regional accounts, eagles were reported to emerge from the cave itself in far greater numbers, circling above the entrance in coordinated, repeating loops before eventually dispersing. Several versions of the account link this display to the cave's own breathing pattern, describing the eagles as emerging in step with a sudden, forceful exhalation from the opening, as though the release of air and the release of birds were part of a single event rather than two separate occurrences. Whether this reflects a genuine ecological pattern tied to pressure changes affecting airflow and insect activity near the cave mouth, a coincidence later folded into ritual memory, or something else entirely, is not something any surviving record can settle. What can be said with more confidence is how those who witnessed the display are said to have responded. According to the accounts, individuals present during an eclipse would lay down weapons, bows, later firearms, and ceremonial items at the mouth of the cave while the eagles circled overhead, believing that the display carried a blessing that passed into whatever was placed there. Once the circling ended, the items were retrieved and were said to be treated afterward as protected, passed down within specific families across multiple generations rather than traded, sold, or displayed. No museum collection and no federal or state archive connected to the Black Hills region has ever catalogued an item explicitly tied to this specific tradition. If such objects still exist today, their location has never been documented in any record available to researchers. Eclipses themselves were never mysterious to the Lakota in an astronomical sense. Like most Plains nations, Lakota knowledge keepers tracked the movements of the sun and moon carefully, and eclipses were understood as predictable events rather than random disruptions. That detail matters because it changes the shape of the mystery. This was not a case of a frightened community reacting to an unexplained sky event. It was, according to these accounts, a community that already understood the mechanics of the eclipse, choosing to treat one specific location out of the entire surrounding landscape as the place where that celestial event and the behavior of the cave and its eagles intersected in a way worth marking with ceremony. Whoever first noticed that pattern, whether across a single lifetime of careful observation or across many generations of quiet attention, was watching something closely enough to connect three separate phenomena: a rare sky event, a breathing cave, and the movement of a specific bird into a single, repeated occasion for ritual. Wildlife biologists who study raptor behavior near cave systems today note that sudden changes in air pressure and temperature at a cave mouth can influence insect activity, which in turn can influence the feeding and movement patterns of birds nearby. It is not difficult to imagine a plausible, entirely natural explanation building on that foundation, one where eagles were drawn to the cave entrance by shifts in air and prey availability that happen to correlate loosely with rare atmospheric events. But no formal study has ever been conducted specifically at Wind Cave to confirm or dismiss this pattern, largely because the tradition itself was never treated by outside researchers as something worth testing. It survived instead the way most oral traditions survive, through repetition, through respect, and through the quiet decision of specific families to keep it rather than explain it. Is it possible that a natural, explainable pattern of raptor behavior near a pressure-driven cave opening was gradually reinterpreted over generations as something sacred? Is it possible that the timing of eclipses, rare and dramatic enough on their own, simply coincided often enough with ordinary eagle activity to create the appearance of a pattern where none truly existed? Or is it possible that something about this specific location, already unusual enough to breathe like a living thing, was in fact observed with more precision by generations of Lakota observers than any single federal survey conducted in a matter of months? The 1903 survey answered some of its own questions. It confirmed the cave's air pressure behavior. It documented the boxwork formations in detail sufficient for later geologists to build upon. It established, at least provisionally, that people had used this cave long before any settler arrived in the region. What it never resolved, and what no survey since has fully resolved, is the deeper question sitting underneath all of that data. Why this cave? Why this specific opening, out of every fracture and cavity in an entire mountain range, became the place where an origin story took root and endured for so many generations? History rarely offers clean separations between what can be measured and what can only be remembered. Wind Cave sits directly on that boundary. The barometric data is real and repeatable. Anyone standing at the entrance today on the right kind of day can feel the air moving against their skin. The boxwork is real, and geologists continue to study it as one of the most unusual formations of its kind anywhere on Earth. The Lakota emergence tradition is real, in the sense that it was recorded, preserved, and carried forward by specific people across specific generations, not invented for outsiders and not altered to fit convenience. What remains uncertain is where explanation ends and memory begins. Perhaps the eagles that gathered during eclipses were responding to something ordinary, insects disturbed by pressure shifts, temperature changes at dawn, patterns that any patient observer might notice given enough decades of watching the same hillside. Or perhaps there was something more difficult to categorize taking place at that entrance, something that a purely mechanical survey was never equipped to detect in the first place. Every generation that has stood at the mouth of Washun Niya has had to decide, in its own way, how much of the story to trust. That decision, more than any single measurement, may be the real subject of this documentary. Not whether the cave breathes. It does. Not whether Lakota tradition names this place as an origin point. It does. But whether the space between those two facts, the space that a 1903 engineer with a barometer could never fully close, is something we are meant to explain away, or something we are meant to sit with, unresolved, the way the people who lived closest to this cave for the longest stretch of time apparently chose to do. History is often treated as a finished record, a sequence of dates and discoveries that add up to a settled account of what happened. Wind Cave resists that treatment. It offers a precise, documented moment, the 1903 survey, a real physical phenomenon that can still be measured today, and an oral tradition old enough that no one can say with certainty when it began. Between those three things sits a mystery that has never required exaggeration to remain compelling. It only requires attention. And perhaps that is the most honest place any documentary about this cave can end. Not with an answer, but with the same question that the Lakota, the settlers, and the federal surveyors of 1903 all seem to arrive at from different directions. What exactly is this place, and what has it been quietly keeping since long before anyone thought to write it down? Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through original records, archaeology, and the oral traditions of the people who lived closest to these places, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. And before you go, I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the eagles that gathered at Washun Niya during solar and lunar eclipses were responding to something ordinary? Or do you think the Lakota who witnessed that display for generations noticed something that no survey ever managed to explain? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.